I'd like to call to order the May 4th meeting, the WTA Board of Directors. We've had a slight change to the agenda since originally announced. We've added an executive session. We'll do that first thing after we do roll call and citizen communications. Roll call, please.
Okay. Davidson, I believe, is absent. Donovan is absent. Fleetwood. We do have Seth Fleetwood. He's just moving from one location to another. Hawkinson.
Here.
Huffman.
Here.
Lilyquist.
Here.
Sadhu.
Here. Present.
Darwin. Okay, and we have Cortes and Lautenbach absent. Thank you.
I'm here.
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Great. Are there any citizen communications that we don't know about, either in writing or other means?
Vicki, did you receive any last night?
No.
So is there any member of the public here who would like to address the board? If so, unmute or raise your virtual hand. Okay, I don't think there are any. So we're going to go ahead and do our first item, which is an executive session. This is a meeting on a matter with legal counsel and under RCW 42.30.110. This will be done in private. We're asking people who aren't authorized to be here to leave. We will adjourn and resume live broadcast in about how many minutes? In about 10 minutes.
All right, I'll go ahead and send you over. Vicki, are you going to the executive session?
Can't hear you, Vicki.
I can't hear you.
Les, would you like me to be in the executive session or stay in the main session?
No, I think it's board clerk. Be good.
Okay, thank you.
And Josh will be in as well. Yeah, he's on that. He should be transitioning over.
Okay, I think there might be something within the room that you all need to push to move yourselves over.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Thank you, Audra. Appreciate the adult supervision.
Okay. Great, so we'll stay here. I'll be back on in 10 minutes if we're not back already with any updates. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So there's a concern. It's not just WTA, it's throughout every entity that's looking at it. But the concern is that if you're allowing anybody to hop on the bus, are there issues with destinationless riders, as they say? Folks that there's no barrier, there's no card to turn on, turn off to give an indication. So if there's behavioral things, you're relying on just noticing the person as opposed to having a card, for example, or things of that nature. So there's concerns about how that would work. Part of this too is how the new transit safety officer program works to help. This will give us a couple years to see how that's working, and maybe that helps allay fears that we find out it's not, or we have the capacity to respond to things. Does that answer?
That does. Thank you.
That Paul?
The other thing is that it is my impression over last, even during COVID, of course, that was a totally different circumstances, that just reducing fares to zero does not necessarily increases ridership. That people might expect that it dramatically increases that ridership. So, I mean, that's the whole intention, I believe, is that can we serve more people, or is the barrier that because of the fares, people don't ride the bus? So I don't know. I don't have a substantial study to back it up, but this is general impression over the years that doing it zero does not really necessarily have more people coming in right.
And that's one of the things that we could see. There's some indications coming in that it may, but there's also indications that the same riders taking more rides.
Yes.
And so there's a number of things to
It's-
parse through on that.
Yeah.
The big intent, I think, from staff perspective is providing we're looking at equity, efficiency, environment as guiding lights, and the equitable portion of that. Does that help with those that, like you said, removing a barrier on that? We do currently give out the board's authorized 55,000 6-ticket trips to social services and law enforcement and others to use. So there is that part of it.
I think paradoxically, the fact that we keep the fare so low is a reason why dropping it to 0 wouldn't have a profound effect. But it's also the reason why keeping it is sort of less important, right? If it was 25% of our revenue and it cost $5 a ride, then that would be a huge decision. So paradoxically, and I think it's a good thing that we keep our fare so low, paradoxically, it kind of reduces the stakes. Polly?
Thanks. I think the reasoning behind the recommendation is really sound. I think particularly when it comes to understanding capacity for workload, something I'm learning is sitting from my position. Sometimes it's like, well, why can't you do it all? But I know that's not the case. And I also think that the more data and the more information that we have from other communities that have made the change will give us a lot more insight into whether or not it's a good change for us. And if we do make the change, how to do it in the most efficient way possible and effective way possible. One question I do have though is about equipment. Are there any major equipment upgrades that we're looking at in the next couple of years that would be different if we went to no fare versus continuing to collect fares?
No, like, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jeff, sorry.
Yeah, and I know Tammy just joined too, but with the fare collection system, no, we don't. We've reviewed the next 6 years out, and we don't anticipate making any upgrades or major replacements. Everything we have will just replace individual units as they fail.
I guess I'd look at staff if there's anything that I didn't cover. Right.
So there's no vote or motion that's needed on this. If there's no further discussion, we'll consider silence as complicity and move on. Thanks, Les, for bringing that forward. The next item is consideration of a governing framework for service changes. Again, this is coming back from the issue that was discussed at the previous board meeting. Les?
So based on the discussion with the board last meeting, in regards to some paratransit changes as detailed in the background section there, the issue came up on board governance and essentially what service changes come to the board and have a public hearing under section 7.2 of the bylaws, which is in full in the board packet. So on discussion on that was what is the appropriate board governance over service changes, and when does it need to go through the public hearing process for board approval? So went back and thought about it. What is a governance framework that staff and board could work through going forward to make sure that we're hitting the expectations. So the intent was to create a framework that would allow the board to have oversight and governance capabilities of what the service changes were, as well as trying to read the various governance documents consistently. So the bylaws, statute, and the delegation of authority. And so there's a proposed framework here that I'll cover in just a second. The backgrounds on it, those governing documents is section 7.2, talks about when there's a substantial change in service, there's a public hearing requirement and board approval, and lays out examples of what that is. The delegation and the bylaws also delegate daily operational matters to staff. But one of the things that's in the delegation, which I think is important, is that significant matters do need to be reported to the board. So trying to read all those things and trying to consistently and trying to balance the policy level decisions with the daily operational decisions, tried to come up with a framework to govern that and provide us some guidance going forward. And so what we propose for discussion, and its discussion, is three kind of categories. One is not significant, and those are kind of just the truly daily things, like getting a request to remove a bus stop somewhere else, construction or something, and we're moving those things. The second category would be significant, but not substantial. So under the delegation, significant requires a report to the board, but it's not substantial for a public hearing process. Those would be things that are legally or regulatorily required. So for example, under the ADA, we may have to make some changes or trying to be more efficient, more compliant as like technology comes on board and those kinds of things. We can do those things, but those or they're changes in ways of needs and methods of service. They're not changing for lack of a better term, the routes and schedules, but they're changing kind of the ways that service is delivered. The important thing about that from a governance perspective is significant matters are still reported to the board. So the board is aware of those. And then the third category is substantial. Obviously anything specifically detailed in 7.2. But then all those other things that are those routes and schedules, kind of things that would go into it that would come to that. So under this proposed framework and process, what would happen is obviously staff would make the initial call on it. If it's in that second category, significant but not substantial, still comes to the board. If it's substantial, obviously it goes through the process. So from a governance standpoint, all significant and substantial changes do come to the board. So the board could say, hey, we disagree that that's your decision that was significant. We think that is substantial. We want it to go through a public hearing process. So there's that oversight that's going, and hopefully that would allow the assessment of whether it's a policy level decision or kind of a day-to-day operational decision from the board's perspective, and then give us guidance and framework on how to approach these to meet the board's expectation. So I'll pause there.
So the proposed action is that the board consider endorsing this proposed framework. If we do so, then the framework, only the last category, substantial, would trigger the bylaws requirement for a public hearing.
And we would put this in, we have a service change policy that we would update and add it in there. So that's where it would live for staff.
Yeah, so it would live in an administrative policy if we support the framework. Discussion. Dan.
So, just to the specific application example I wanted to speak on, just part of this, I guess I'll just kind of read what I put. I disagree that a change to will calls would not be a substantial change. Our current bylaws, a substantial change in service includes a change in the span of service of more than 10 minutes of published start time, as well as change in frequency of service, either an increase or decrease. But when you compare the fixed route service to our complementary paratransit service, it's a bit of comparing apples to oranges. On fixed route, it's very easy to quantify a change in service under these parameters. There are published times that increasing or decreasing by 10 minutes, as well as increasing or decreasing the frequency of service are quantifiable measures. But in paratransit, we can't easily see those numbers. We do have a robust system that can give us any number of reports that we want to look at, but they're not easily quantifiable. I believe that a substantial change in paratransit is one which is non-regulatory, but has a direct effect on those who utilize the service. When this was brought up at the last meeting, it was prefaced with the caveat that some board members might actually hear from your constituents about this. So if it's known in advance that this will have an effect so great that you should be expecting calls from those who use the service, then I would consider that to be a substantial change, and those changes should be approved by the public that has entrusted us with this service. So I would again ask the board to prioritize this as an action item at future items and seek out public comments before making a change. as we would when there are changes to the fixed route system.
So thank you, Dan. I think the point you're raising is not so much that the framework is a problem, but the judgment call of when something is substantial or just significant. And so even if this framework were in place, for example, Dan might disagree and might say, no, that was substantial. And administration say, no, that was significant, but not substantial. So this framework doesn't solve that judgment issue. That's the way I would frame it. Jen?
So I would less say that if it came to the board as a significant but not substantial change, then the board would have the option to say, we view this as significant. We would like to see a public hearing on this change within the framework that they're proposing. Is that correct? So then at that time, Dan's concern would come to the board could decide whether they, we agreed with that concern and wanted to have a public hearing, or if we felt that staff was correct and that it would go forward as staff had planned. Is that correct? So then,
Yeah, I was kind of thinking of it like a consent agenda item, that you can put something on consent agenda and a board member or others the board could say, hey, we don't think that's a consent agenda. We want to talk about it and pull it off. So same kind of thing. We would come to the board, much like what happened this time, is to report to the board, here's what's going on, here's what we think determined as significant. And the board could say, well, to Dan's point, we disagree with that judgment, and I think it's substantial.
so if that is the case, then I think the procedure as outlined here is fine, and we should go forward with it. But then the second item would then be Dan's concern about the change itself. So it's actually two separate issues at this point.
Other board members? So I think I think your analogy, Les, of consent agenda is worrisome for me, because I think there is kind of a tendency to go with staff recommendations, right? If someone has to make efforts to pull something from the consent agenda, or make efforts to say, no, that's not just significant, it's substantial, it takes a bit of courage, frankly, to speak up. And rather than relying upon board members to decide whether it's worth the trouble to make waves, I think it'd be better if it was brought forward in a more neutral fashion. So it may be that procedurally significant but not substantial changes should be brought forward with the board with a very active question to endorse that categorization, rather than presume. I think it should be brought forward with a question. Staff is bringing this forward as a significant but not substantial change. The board is being asked to consider whether or not it is indeed significant or whether it's indeed substantial. Looking for direction, further clarification. You see how that brings that forward as still with a staff recommendation, but kind of just a little bit more open, so that not everyone has to be as courageous as Dan has been, I think, in flagging an important issue.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it would be a not under our staff reports, it would be a board action item. Any of those kinds of changes we would bring, whether significant or substantial, bring under action item with a recommendation and board vote to say.
Yeah, I mean, this is my philosophy. It's why I had you bring forward the pause on the zero fare. I think it's better to bring it forward with an active question to the board, so there's no doubt. And so, you see what I'm saying?
I do. I'm trying to think through.
It both puts the proper burden on us, but I mean, I also think that it gives WTA leadership, I hate to call it cover, but it gives them genuine authorization. There's no doubt. The board has heard it, the board has seen it, the board has agreed, we're going along with it. You're not out on the staff is not out on a limb. Step Paul?
Are we talking just from Dan's perspective that reduced will calls is the major issue? Like if we look at the 4 points that have been written here, right? And is it that maybe it should be more defined? What are the methods to be used to reduce the will calls. Maybe that can cause some more discussion. That I'm just assuming that's the only.
Well, for me, it was that I believe this is a substantial change and there's not, it's because a lot of what our substantial changes show in our framework is all related to fixed route. And most of the changes through paratransit, because it's a complimentary service, are regulatory. It's because we have to do them. This is a particular one that we have chosen to do over the years. And, you know, it's made people's lives a lot better. And so I feel like since we have that, to make that change, because it's something we're choosing to do, it's not something we have to do, that the public then should have a say in what we're doing, which then would be a substantial change. So that's kind of where I'm looking at it from, but again, this is, you know.
Okay, so my flip question to that is less, or the administration, are we looking at to do this reduced will calls is from the system efficiency, or is it because of the cost? Because we know that paratransit is substantially expensive compared to the rest of the services, right? So, like, what is the underlying objective that we should reduce the will calls? Maybe it's not efficient for us how we do that, you know.
So
I can see that.
I'll say a little bit and then ask Eric and Shelley, because they live it, but essentially it's an efficiency thing that it's very difficult to dispatch when you don't know when things are coming and things cancel and move around. And what we're trying to do is through that efficiency is build greater capacity to more efficiently move folks around.
Yeah, that's what same came to my mind.
Yeah. And then I'll pause and ask Eric or Shelley. Eric?
Yeah, I can't, it's hard for me to see Shelley. I don't want to speak over you, Shelley, but.
She's at the table now.
Okay, yeah. She's about this big on my screen, so.
Could you hear everything okay, Eric?
I could, yes, thank you.
Okay.
Another element of this is a change that we've been looking at for quite some time, but have really held off on until we were able to rearrange our scheduling processes to allow for our paratransit passengers to schedule a pickup time rather than just a destination time. Will calls are really based on, hey, I'm ready now. Can you please come get me now? Now that you can book from a, hey, I'll be ready at this time, it gives the passengers a lot more freedom and flexibility on how they're building their days to replace the impact of the loss of will calls. And so there's a tying together of these really three efforts that Shelley and her team have been working on that made the timing work well. And then additionally adding the new ADA corridor service out in the Blaine Birch Bay area, the efficiency need is right now in our face. And so bringing all four of those together at this time worked well. Shelley, I'll pass it over to you if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Sure. So we do not know what the impact of the Blaine Birch Bay ADA corridor will be. It could be minimal or it could be significant. It is a large geographical area. We don't know what those travel patterns will be. We don't know how many riders we're going to have. And for example, yesterday we had 700 plus, I think 750 plus rides. Of those rides, 300 of those were will calls. So you can't schedule them. And so what would happen if we continue to do will calls with the very few limits that are currently on them is we are required by regulations to perform the scheduled rides on time. We have to do that. The feds really expect at least a 98% on-time performance for the scheduled rides. So will calls, people with will calls would sit and wait longer than if they had a scheduled ride. They might wait 2 hours to get picked up, whereas if we have a scheduled ride, we have to pick them up and deliver them within a certain amount of time. I will say there are very few people that take 4 will calls in a day, which is the limit at the moment. Of the 300 and plus will calls yesterday, a third of those were medical returns. So those were people who were at a medical appointment of some sort and were ready to go home. So we would still be performing and that's kind of we've looked at it over time. It's generally on any given day, a third of the will calls are medical returns. The reason we did tie it to the Birch Bay Blaine is that we do not know what that impact will be. And generally speaking, if we get tight staffed, what we do is we pull a driver from a paratransit shift and put them on fixed route and rearrange people. That won't be an option until we have some sort of an idea of how Birch Bay Blaine is going to impact our staffing and our vehicle resources. So I do think it will impact a few people who use will calls like a taxi, but it won't impact most people, and it can actually improve things because then they can schedule that pickup instead of having that long window. Otherwise, they're going to be sitting there for 2 and 3 hours.
So I want to refocus the conversation and then hopefully add to it. The refocus is, we're not really here to debate the paratransit change, its merits or not. I mean, it's an important discussion, but that's not the agenda item in front of us. It's the framework. And I think there's an important element that's missing in the framework that I think should be there, that I read in there, and I want to see if other people agree. And that is, the issue here has to do with whether or not should be a public hearing, whether or not the rider's experience in terms of its utility and convenience and value to them changes. I can imagine a huge organizational change inside WTA that riders don't notice and don't care about, right? So what matters here, whether it's significant or substantial or not, I think has to do with whether or not the rider's experience is changed. Is the rider going to notice it? Will it affect the rider's experience? And I don't see that explicitly mentioned, right? It's not the size of the change, it's whether or not the public needs to be notified about it, whether or not it needs to be a public hearing. So the significant point behind substantial is that the public is affected enough that the public needs to be heard from. So I would keep the framework. I like the 3 buckets. But I would add language in there that clearly has to do with what needs to be looked at as whether or not this is going to affect how the rider is able to use the system, the value and utility to the riders. And if there's a change there, then it's substantial, or if there's not much of a change there, rather than like the complicatedness or even the efficiency changes or the cost changes, right? If we can make a huge efficiency and cost change that no one notices, I don't care how much money it saves, it's not substantial in the sense of requiring a public hearing. So if people agree with me, I would just ask Les to rewrite those to indicate that that is sort of the issue that needs to be focused on when conducting the analysis of which bin it belongs in. Am I on track?
For me, yes.
Yes, I agree. That's what my whole point from the beginning is, that if we are affecting how people utilize and use our service, then those people should have a say, or at least to have a public comment and know about these changes beforehand. That's all. And then we can make decisions based on that.
Right. I mean, it may be, for example, that these changes are going to be embraced warmly, right? It's like the point that Dan's bringing up is not that these are bad changes, but that they're substantial changes, good or bad. I'm putting words in your mouth, Dan.
Oh, that sounded good.
Okay. Les?
As to the will call.
Well,
So I'm trying to think, so these changes were set to go in effect June 11th to dovetail with the Route 75 expansion, which was board approved. So those changes that were part of that had already been gone through the public hearing. So there's that aspect of it. So we'd have to push off, we'd have to think through. So there's some negative consequences with that, with the new framework that we'd be looking at going forward. That aspect of it can be handled because we'll just put it into our timeline of how we're doing changes, so we can address that going forward. It's the current one that causes some issues, and I mean, I'm glad this got raised. So going forward, we understand what expectations are, because this is a change from historically what had been happening. So this is good to have the governance discussion.
Is there any other feedback on my suggestion that the writer's experience needs to be central to the analysis? Again, silence is complicity. We've got a couple nods in the room.
So if I could just repeat back to make sure that as I go to try to translate that, that essentially in the analysis of significant, substantial that would be brought to the board for decision point, part of that analysis, one of the factors is what's the effect on the writer experience, and then how we answer that question will depend on what it is and what outreach we do at a time. Thanks. Did
I think so.
capture the summary?
So I'm going to go ahead and make a motion just to get this clear. I move that the board support the adoption of the three-part framework with the understanding that the framework will be rewritten to highlight the significance of the writer experience in making the determination. Is there a second?
I'll second that.
Is there any discussion?
Yeah,
Seeing
I'll
none,
make a
all those in
second.
favor signify by saying aye or raise your virtual hand. Aye.
Aye.
Seth, I don't know if I can't see what you did or didn't do. Well, I think we have enough votes to say the motion passed. I don't know, Dan, did you, all those in favor, not in favor signify by saying no.
No,
Okay, split vote, but I still think the vote passes. Thank you very much. We'll go on to the next item. The next items, which are reports to the board. First, the preliminary.
I'm sorry, can I just ask a clarifying
Go ahead.
question? So on the will call change, we're planning on moving forward with that. Is there an objection to that? I just don't want to move forward with that and then I'm sorry to put on.
No, I understand. So the item before us was the governing framework. I think we've disposed of that. We could bring up in a certain sense under old and new to revisit the other issue. I was trying to separate the framework from the actual substance of the changes.
Wholeheartedly, but after that discussion, I was left. I would rather deal with it up front than afterwards.
Appreciate it. Board, is there any further discussion, not on the framework, but on the actual paratransit changes?
I still think that we should have public comments on it because it's a change to the rider experience. And I think that they should have a say in what's going on, but the board decide on that.
I apologize that I put the board into an awkward position on this, but I do appreciate the going forward, having that framework that will help us govern and meet expectations. Thank you.
Okay, Jen?
I agree with Dan. I think this was a big change for writers. I disagreed with changing the framework a little bit, but since it was brought up, this is a substantial and I think significant change for writers and to implement without some of the education to the public beforehand, I think would maybe cause some increased anxiety around this change. So I do think that a public hearing would be very helpful for this topic.
So there will be public outreach. We've got a variety of things planned that we put on hold while this was based on last time's discussion. So there will be outreach.
Yes, but so what I'm hearing though is that the change will be effective June 11th. So will public outreach be done before the effective change date on June 11th, or is it we're changing it and then we'll tell educate people about it. I guess that was,
It was before.
Unclear to me.
Shelley and her team have done a job, have a communications plan, and my fault based on the last meeting. I asked them to still continue prep and get everything all set, and then just hold on launching until today.
We would have already been halfway through that process. We have additional staff coming to do outgoing calls. We have that training for some of the CSRs that will take those calls. We had a newsletter ready to go. We had other stuff that we put it on hold. So the shorter education time it just happened that way. So.
Board members, anything else? I guess I would just say lessons learned on this one. Okay. Seeing nothing else, we're going on. Consent agenda is the next item. Consent agenda consists of consideration of approval of routine expenditures and approval of the minutes from April 6th.
Move to approve.
second,
A motion before us to approve the consent agenda. If no items are being pulled, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed? Okay, that passes. Reports to the board. Again, first the preliminary financial report and then the general manager's report.
I'll take the financial report. 2022 was a good year. Sales tax, 3.6 million above budget. We are seeing a little bit of decline in the February receipts for 2023, and our sister agencies are experiencing that, so we're going to continue to watch that. Still above budget, but a smaller growth. All the COVID relief funds have come in, so you'll see the cash balances are higher, about 20 million higher. We expect that most of those will be designated into reserve funds for capital projects as we get through the CIP process for 2024. With the zero emission transition plan, actually the rapid transit, a lot of the initiatives we're looking at, we expect that we'll be allocating those dollars.
Sorry, I got to leave.
Okay, thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Simple.
Expenses were under budget, primarily in salaries and benefits. A lot of that's due to the adjustment from GASB, the required adjustment that we have to make. Capital revenues and expenses both under budget. We have 3 bus orders that have been delayed, so we haven't paid for those or received the reimbursements. The auditors are here now doing 3 audits simultaneously, financial accountability and the federal single audit. So they're looking at the accuracy of numbers, our compliance with our policies and regulations, and then both of those for the federal dollars that we receive. It's going well. Our goal is to get them out of here by the end of May, so there can be a long weekend in our future. So we'll report out on that. We'll have an exit conference when the auditors are done, and we can give you the update on that. Open for any questions.
Board members, any questions?
Thank you.
Great. I'll preserve my report for the next board meeting because it's right after 9. The only thing of urgent is Sunday is the rodeo. Starts at 9. Should be decent weather. Should be a lot of fun. Thanks to Audra and Becky and Jeff for all their efforts and the whole staff team for pulling that together. Should be a lot of fun. So the rest I'll reserve till next time because there's nothing urgent in there.
Any further business for the WTA Board of Directors? Seeing none, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.